Tonight on KQED Newsroom, Senator Dianne Feinstein sits down with us to talk about the Saudi crisis, Justice Kavanaugh, and why she's seeking a fifth term. Plus, mailed pipe bombs rock the political world as the midterm elections approach. We'll check in with our politics panel on that, and the last-minute scramble for votes. And one journalist's scathing critique of the rich and powerful philanthropists who claim to change the world while preserving the status quo. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with the U.S. Senate race. Senator Dianne Feinstein is currently the nation's longest-serving female senator, and she's seeking another term. A ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Feinstein recently made headlines for her role in the controversial Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings. Now, in the wake of journalist Jamal Khashoggi's death, Feinstein joins three other senators in a letter to President Trump on Tuesday, denouncing his handling of the Saudi crisis. At 85 years old, she says she still has much she wants to accomplish, with issues such as climate change and gun safety still on her agenda. As part of our election coverage, KQED Politics Senior Editor Scott Schaefer sat down with Dianne Feinstein earlier, and we want to give full disclosure here. Senator Feinstein and her husband are past donors to KQED.
Senator Feinstein, thanks for coming in.
Oh, you're so welcome.
You are asking the voters for another 6-year term. What would you like to do with your time?
Well, what I want to do is be constructive and be helpful to our state, to our nation, and California today is either the 5th or 6th largest economic power on earth. So I would like to see that economic power properly delivered to make the world a better place for people.
You, of course, are on the Intelligence Committee. You're privy to all kinds of information about things that are happening with our allies and with our adversaries. And I want to ask you about Saudi Arabia, because, of course, the apparent murder of Jamal Khashoggi has put a lot of focus on the attention on Saudi Arabia. What do you think the U.S. should do with regard to punishing or responding to what's happened?
Well, I can tell you what I won't do. I will not vote for Saudi arms sales. I'm concerned about how they're conducting the war in Yemen, the school buses they've hit, the children they've killed. And I'm really surprised that this was enabled by the monarchy to take place. And it had to have been that way. I think we all know enough of the story now to know that this just didn't happen. It was planned. People were sent to carry it out. This is not anyone's way, let alone the American way.
So you don't buy the president's line that we can't give up this $110 billion arms deal?
No, that's not what we stand for. We're not a country that revolves around arms sales. We're a country that revolves around American values and human rights values. And that's what's made this country so desirable all over the world. It's not arms sales. It's what we are as a people and what we believe. And it's our sense of what's right and what's wrong and the ability to fight for right. And right now, we have a fight for right with Saudi Arabia.
I want to ask you about the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. You're the ranking Democrat, and you did get that letter from Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, and you got some criticism for holding on to it, for not giving it to the FBI sooner than you did.
Yes,
any regrets
Republicans
about that?
did. I would probably do it differently. The letter in 3 places said this is confidential. When I talked to her, she was not in shape to come forward. Let me say that. That was my judgment. It was not a short phone call. And I agreed to keep it confidential. She didn't want. When it all changed is when she came forward. And then when she agreed to testify. And then I gave it to the committee.
Yeah, and what would you do differently?
Well, it's a very hard question, Scott. It took this woman a long time, and this testimony was not easy for her. So terrible things happen to women, and this woman was 15 years old when it happened.
Do you have any regrets about the way it was handled?
No. I had to handle it that way, and I think I know how it came out, and I learned a lesson there, because I believe it came out from another colleague, and that was a surprise.
A colleague, another senator?
Yes.
Can you say
That's
which
my
one?
belief. No, I would never do that. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah. I want to ask you about your reelection. You're 85 years old. And this week, Joe Biden, who I think is 75, said that if he runs for president in 2020, age is a relevant issue. Bernie Sanders said the same thing. I think he's 77 or will be soon. Do you think is it a relevant issue in this race?
Sure. I mean, it's a consideration. If people want somebody younger, they have somebody younger. I really believe that my history has given me certain abilities to do certain things. And if people don't agree with that, then vote another way. But my health is good. I can go the distance. I enjoy it. And a good part of my life is wrapped around helping people. It's just, for me, their satisfaction. I can tell you individual stories, but it makes my life worthwhile too. And I can give to people.
You were mayor of San Francisco for many years. And there is a measure on the San Francisco ballot, Measure C, would tax the wealthiest companies in San Francisco and generate about $350 million a year for homelessness. Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, is for it. Mayor Breed and others are against it. What's your position?
I'm for it. Yes. Why? Because we have to help. We don't have a choice. When you see someone lying, and I just did, on a hot sidewalk, sleeping with nothing, that's not the United States of America. And particularly if they happen to be an addict, an alcoholic, or medically ill.
The critics of Measure C, and they include the Chamber of Commerce and others, say that it's going to cost jobs and that it's going to influx too much money, that they don't have a plan for spending.
Look, I'm going to vote for virtually almost any homeless plan. I just am, because this is my country, this is my city. I grew up in San Francisco. People weren't homeless. A lot of people looked at it, well, this will last for 5 years and then it'll pass. It hasn't. It's gotten worse. It's involved more families, more youngsters.
I think it's been about, if my math is right, 30 years since you've been mayor of San Francisco.
That's about right.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, you know, the city now is so different, and especially the economy. I mean, the tech industry is so prevalent now. And I'm wondering, like, what do you see as the upside and the downside of those changes?
Well, the upside is jobs. And the upside is producing a whole new generational competitive workforce based on new instruments, which is technology, which didn't exist those 30 years ago. And it's kind of fascinating to watch. History is going to show us whether it's worthwhile or not.
What do you see as the downside?
To be very candid, I don't see tech as very civically involved. And I think they have to be. And I think the CEOs, like when I was mayor, the CEOs of the big banks, I could go in and ask them to help with any civic cause. Cross my heart, I never got a no.
Why do you think CEOs today in the tech industry are less receptive to that?
I don't understand it, to be honest with you. It's a much more reserved world. It's sort of a world apart to some extent. To meet with some of the tech leaders, and I guess they're like any other group of people. There are some that want to be helpful, and there's some that don't.
Senator Dianne Feinstein, thank you so much for coming in.
Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, continuing with politics, more than a dozen pipe bombs were mailed to prominent Democrats and critics of President Trump, including several California recipients. Today, suspicious packages were found in Sacramento and Burlingame, addressed to Senator Kamala Harris and billionaire Democratic activist Tom Steyer. A Florida suspect, Cesar Sayoc, is now in custody. Also, President Trump is reportedly considering shutting down the U.S.-Mexico border in response to the caravan from Honduras. And more on key House races with Bay Area volunteers campaigning in the Central Valley. Joining us to discuss all these issues are Hoover Institution fellow Lanhee Chen, Joe Garofoli, senior political writer with the San Francisco Chronicle, and Sean Walsh, a Republican strategist with Wilson Walsh Consulting. Nice to have all of you back.
Wonderful to be here.
Lanhi, we're continuing to learn more about the pipe bomb scare, more about the suspects. Many of the targets are Democrats, some of them the sharpest critics of President Trump. Some are now Californians, as we are learning today. How is this affecting the tone on Capitol Hill?
Well, to the extent it's making the tone more civil, it's a temporary change. I think, unfortunately, our politics have become very coarse. I think the level of discourse, frankly, is not nearly what it's been at points in the past. Obviously, in this situation, there's a few issues to highlight. One is how remarkably quickly law enforcement was able to figure out what was going on. Really remarkable. A lot of this capacity was developed post 9/11. Our ability to get to the bottom of these sorts of things has improved dramatically over the last several years. I think politicians generally have tried to stay above this. They've tried to take the tone and elevate it. But politics in the U.S. has become such that it's very difficult to stay there. I think, unfortunately, we're going to see this maybe last for a few days at most, and then it's going to be back to business as usual.
Well, in fact, we're still seeing some inflammatory language, right, Joe? I mean, in response to the bombs, the president did call for unity, but then shortly thereafter, he posted tweets attacking the media. He posted tweets saying the pipe bombs are slowing down Republican momentum, so Republicans get out and vote. What impact will this have on the run-up to the midterm elections?
I don't know about the impact on the elections, but it's as Lonnie said, where this will be a temporary break. I mean, remember after the shooting on the baseball field a year ago, there was like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. People opening fire on members of Congress. Everybody's like, oh, this is terrible for about, a week? So I don't know how it affects the midterms. I think that at this point of the game, around a week before Election Day, everybody's kind of locked into their positions. In most of these races, there's only a few percentage points of people who are undecided or in the middle. So I don't know if it affects that at all.
Looking ahead, Sean, I mean, what will it take to press the reset button and bring the hostilities down and stop all this inflammatory language and this divisiveness?
So the first thing that Mr. Schumer and Ms. Pelosi came out and did was criticize President Trump for his incendiary rhetoric. And there's a lot of Republicans that just roll their eyes. There's been nearly a dozen firebombings of Republican campaign offices across the country, graffiti, including the Mr. McCarthy's own office that had stones thrown through there. So it's a very ugly period, and it's going to continue to be ugly. I condemn and deplore the president's rhetoric, but the Democrats are really across the board doing the same thing, and everybody needs to grow up. They really do.
I think the president should be held to a higher standard, though. He is the president. He is representing all of us, and I think he should be representing us at the highest level possible. He should be setting the tone here.
I agree, Joe, and I condemn the president's rhetoric, but when the Democratic establishment says it's a resistance movement, get in their face. I mean, anti-Maxi or Kerosene Maxine, depending on how you want to define her, says go out and get in these people's faces. People that are mentally unhinged are going to go do bad things. They're going to do bad things to administration staff and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. This stuff really is out of control, and it's out of control, I think, principally because of the social media dynamic. People just can't turn it off all day long. It's hate, hate, hate.
And we're seeing some of that around the caravan of Central American migrants as well, right? Because there have been social media comments about how maybe George Soros backed it. No evidence of that. Claims that Middle Eastern immigrants are part of the pack. No evidence of that. And meanwhile, President Trump, the big news today is that he's reportedly considering shutting the U.S. border to Central Americans, reportedly denying them the chance to seek asylum. The White House is also planning to send additional U.S. troops to assist in border security operations. Lanhi, does this amount to stoking American anxieties about immigration? It's something that we saw worked to his advantage, President Trump's advantage in 2016. Is that strategy now working for him also heading into the midterms?
Well, immigration has been an issue that voters in California around the country have cared about for a number of years. So what we have to understand is the underlying dynamic. The underlying dynamic is one where a lot of America feels that immigration is an issue that represents a feeling of uneasiness. And so I think he is channeling that. I think certainly there is no question that motivating voters ahead of the midterm election is crucially important for both parties. Immigration is an issue that motivates Republicans. It always has been. And to the extent that the president is using it in that way, I think he sees it as an opportunity to boost Republican turnout for the election this November. Now, we can talk about the long-term implications of of using immigration in that way. But fundamentally, we can't forget where we are in the election cycle. We can't forget that this issue is one that does get people to the polls.
And how is it playing out in the Central Valley? Joe, you were there. You were talking to volunteers from the Bay Area. You were focusing on the race between Jeff Denham, the Republican incumbent from the Modesto area, and his Democratic challenger, Josh Harder. How is immigration playing out there?
Immigration is playing out there. Folks there aren't really tuned into the stuff that's going on in Washington or even the caravan for that matter. Immigration there is a very personal issue. Everybody knows somebody who's affected by it. Even the farmers who may not have a relative who's facing some sort of immigration issue. That's labor. It's a labor issue too. And it's very much that issue. That race down there is playing out. And the Bay Area is involved. Jeff Denham, who's the incumbent there, the Republican, is running against the Bay Area. He calls his opponent, Josh Harder, who has spent a few years in the Bay Area as a venture capitalist, Bay Area Harder. And he said if he wins, he will be importing Bay Area values to the Central Valley. The Harder says that Denham has not represented the Valley well enough on issues like immigration, on health care. And so, and he is getting a lot of money from the Bay Area. He's got $1 million from people, Bay Area donors, and hundreds of people have donated thousands of volunteer hours to his campaign. I was down there last week in Turlock. There were 369 people coming to canvass for Josh Harder in Turlock. And many of them were from the Bay Area because there's no race here. They have all this resistance energy, as you pointed out. Where do they go with it? Not going to. Barbara Lee's district isn't in jeopery. Pelosi's district, so they go there.
But what's interesting to me about that race is that Denham is actually quite moderate on immigration issues.
Right.
So is the feeling here is that Trump is so unpopular in California that is eventually what's going to kill him? Yes
and no. Trump is unpopular in California, but he's more popular in that district where 43% of the people approve of what he's been doing. And they said, yes, Denham has tried on issues, but he's failed. He tried last year again. He's supported a pathway to legalization before and citizenship, and he's failed. And so they said, he's failed. Let's try this other guy. That's the feeling that Harder wants to portray.
And Sean, if voters are more enthusiastic than usual, is it showing up in early voting?
It is. It's showing up in early voting, not just in California, but across the country. So just entering the studio, I talked to the chairman of the California Republican Party, and he said if the vote was held today, the California delegation would retain 13 of the 14 seats. Now, again, that's early. We'll see.
But early voting, the early voters are usually Republican. They're white. They're older. And that is pretty much the same.
It's not, though. They're 3 to 4% higher in their turnout than what they actually anticipated would be in this turnout. So I think the Republicans have a strong tailwind. So they've got caravan, they've got Kavanaugh, they've got law enforcement issues, and they have a very strong economy. We had some mistakes again with Hillary Clinton coming out and floating a trial balloon. People say, should that really matter? It does matter to a lot of Republicans. So it's motivating Republican voters in these districts to come out, and not just in California, but in Iowa and in Michigan and in New Hampshire.
I think the shape of the election has altered pretty fundamentally in the last couple of weeks. I think Republicans were facing some very serious headwinds going into the Kavanaugh hearings. The last couple of weeks have appreciably, I think, changed Republican prospects to the point where Republicans, barring some cataclysmic change, are going to have control of the U.S. Senate. They may even pick up 2 or 3 seats. You look at states like Missouri and Montana and North Dakota, where the president performed very well. So Senate candidates are now running ahead. They're defending seats in Nevada and Arizona, where they're doing very well. On the House side, I think a lot of people would be surprised that the Democrats won a net of more than 30 seats, if even capturing the majority now. So I think even that is in question. So Republicans have definitely come back from the precipice over these last couple of weeks.
So if I could amplify what
15 seconds.
It's not going to be a blue wave. There may be some blue tornadoes that hit a few districts, but the dynamic really has changed.
All right, we're going to leave it there. I know Joe is looking like he disagrees. We will have to get...
I'll post my feelings on Twitter.
All right. We'll look for your tweet. Thank you. Joe Garofoli with the San Francisco Chronicle, Sean Walsh with Wilson Walsh Consulting, and Lan Hee Chen with the Hoover Institution. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, a critic's view of philanthropy. A new book argues that when today's corporate titans and political leaders try to change the world, they actually preserve the societal problems they say they want to solve. Author and journalist Anand Giridharadas contends the rich and powerful are willing to fight for justice and equality, but only if it doesn't threaten their positions at the top of the social order. His latest book is Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world. And Anand Giridharadas joins us now in the studio. Pleasure to have you.
Great to be here.
Well, you in your book, you tackle the world of philanthropists who want to do good and do well at the same time. We hear all these buzzwords now, a world full of terms like win-win, make a difference, thought leaders. Yet you say that instead of making the world better, they're actually enabling inequality. How so?
It's an amazing thing that we do live in this age where billionaires are giving money away. In this city right now, 2 billionaires are having an argument about the best way to help homeless people. You have 184 people signing the Giving Pledge, and every time you go to the mall, there's red iPhone cases that are going to change the world and tote bags that are going to change the world. Every young person I meet on campus has a social enterprise idea about converting recycled poop into coffee and selling it in Rwanda somehow. And yet, this has been, for all of that elite generosity, an age of elite hoarding. This is the most unequal time in America in 100 years. Last year, the top 1% salaries grew 4 times faster than the bottom 90%. Last year, 82% of all new wealth created went to the global top 1%. So the very same people who talk a lot about giving back, who talk here in Silicon Valley about disruption and starting companies that are going to save the world, those very same people are monopolizing progress in America.
So on the one hand, they're arguing for fixes, but fixes within the current broken system, as opposed to trying to fix the system totally.
When the winners of our age get interested and involved in social change, they change. They're rarely content to just write a check and support an organization that they think is doing good work. They get involved, they get on the board, they shape it, they shape the narrative, they write books about their theories of change. And because of who they are, that becomes influential. So Silicon Valley disruption becomes change. Higher taxes? That's not change.
Because that doesn't benefit them.
Oh, it hurts them. A charter school that they can get involved with, put their name on, mentor a few black kids and say they boast that they got them into Stanford, that's the kind of change they like. Equally funded public schools for all, which would mean that Marin and Palo Alto actually don't get better schools than everybody else, that they're not interested in. Real social policy that would empower women, maternity leave, family leave, harassment policies so women aren't getting groped every day at the office, that's the kind of thing that costs money to implement. But telling women to lean in, you can do that for free. They like that kind of social change.
Is it a matter of cognitive dissonance then, or is there an actual moral lapse or evil intent?
It's a mix. I found this wonderful email from 2007 among the Goldman Sachs leadership that was unearthed through an investigation in which they talk about a bad New York Times story coming at them that's about their role in the mortgage debacle. And they say in the email, hey, we got to try to pitch this reporter on our GS Gives philanthropy. So they understood that a little bit of giving lubricates the engine of continued taking. But I think here in Silicon Valley, it's a different story. I think there's a lot of people, from Mark Zuckerberg to Elon Musk to others, who are earnest in their desire to make the world a better place and who have an almost messianic faith in their own power to make it better, and who therefore are totally blind to those situations in which what is good for them actually diverges from what is good for the world. Facebook is one of the most idealistic companies in American history. It's also the first company in American history to perhaps compromise and tip a federal election, a presidential election. There's no accident, as far as I see it, that these very companies that are so idealistic and talk about making the world better have been so instrumental in building a winner-take-all economy that works for very few people. Them.
So it's clear what you're saying is that you don't believe market-based philanthropy works. So what are you arguing for? Are you arguing for more government intervention, more government spending, and as an extension then, higher taxes?
Yes, among other things. And we should stop being so ashamed of those things. Taxes is the price of civilization. I think rich people in this country probably need to pay a lot more than they're paying to get into line with most of the other rich countries. Apple has $285 billion offshore, while we have 7,499 homeless people here in the city of San Francisco. If the city of San Francisco were a country, the 5-county area around San Francisco were a country, it'd have the 9th highest population of billionaires among countries. And yet it's hard to walk down the street without encountering homeless people.
Let's talk about an issue that's front and center now for the Trump administration, and that is the alleged killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It's put the spotlight on the connection between Saudi money and Silicon Valley. How does this illustrate the kind of hypocrisy that you talk about in your book?
I mean, I have spent the last few years trying to report on the phony idealism of rich people. And Silicon Valley is an epicenter of that. But never in my years of reporting did I come upon such a clear example of that phoniness than the revelation recently that billions of dollars in Saudi government money has found its way into Silicon Valley. And in fact, they have become one of the biggest players, the Saudis, in the valley. They own a huge stake in Uber, in the dog walking app Wag, in DoorDash, in that Slack where everyone has their boring work chats all day long. And it's hard to think about something that so quickly pierces the illusion that Silicon Valley is anything other than a money-making machine. That doesn't mean it's horrible. It just means that the specialness that it has tried to cultivate for itself, this notion that it's here to make the world better, and the idealism is phony. This regime in Saudi Arabia is among the worst on earth. That money is among the dirtiest on earth. It is money that was made causing climate change and is used to enforce the degradation of women and what is in Saudi Arabia essentially a kingdom that is what ISIS looks like if it had conquered a nation state.
It's also noted for its human rights abuses. Do you
48 beheadings in the first couple months of this year.
Do you think the tech entrepreneurs and executives recognize it as hypocrisy, or do they see it as something else?
I mean, look, if they don't reverse course, Silicon Valley is going to be known as Riyadh West very soon. They are so confident in their moral righteousness and in the fact that they're making the world better that they cannot detect incoming information about their hypocrisy. And they're so morally impervious to criticism. And the reality is, this Khashoggi thing has shined a light on, frankly, a relationship America should have changed a long time ago. And I don't mean to put it only on Silicon Valley. Washington has a very corrupt relationship with them. Our weapons companies do. Citigroup had a big Saudi stake. But Silicon Valley claims it's different.
Is this a moment of reckoning for Silicon Valley? Are some people starting to question this relationship between what they're trying to do, innovate, and where they're getting that money from?
A lot of the younger folks who work in these companies, also a lot of women who work at these companies, people of color who work at these, people who have a slightly different take than the Silicon Valley bro thing, are actually coming up with a very different sensibility and a real awareness of power in the world that a lot of that founding generation didn't. And I think they're going to change these companies for the better.
All right, very interesting. Anand Giridharadas, thank you so much for joining us. Your new book is Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that will do it for us. As always, for more of our coverage, you can go to kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.